I still remember the oven light like a tiny lighthouse on the edge of a storm. Wo choti si ring of orange glow any muyas rat pakara the like it promised a minute of peace, a small luxury in a life that had nothing spare. My frozen pizza was not just food, it was a tiny victory, a budget reward after classes and shifts, and the kind of tired that makes your bones ache. Main Enius oven main pizza dalla with the careful ritual of someone who is still counting pennies, who knows the worth of a hot meal. 3:75 I set the timer 25 minutes, and I walked back to my room humming low with the relief you get when something small finally works out. The basement building smelled like damp cardboard and cheap detergent. Us hallway walls pee the same posters peeling at the corners, rent rules and quiet warnings about noise at night. We were 10 locked doors down that corridor, strangers who shared electricity and a common internet bill and nothing else. Zayada log social nahi kardi the. Everyone had their life outside here, and we tolerated each other like polite roommates tolerate leftover dishes. Halfway through the cook time, the oven door made that old creak, the sound you hear when something that has been alive for years shifts and breathes and someone closes a secret. I heard a bedroom door click down the hall and the quiet footsteps of a guy who moved like he always gets his way. I went to peek thinking maybe he was just reheating his food, maybe he had no idea the pizza was in there. And I saw it, a big sheet tray with raw chicken breasts tossed in like an afterthought, and the dial turned up to 425. At that moment my stomach dropped the way it does when your phone rings in the middle of the night, and you already know the number on the screen. I thought nothing, and then I thought everything. Maybe a courtesy knock would have been fine, a quick "Hey, can I turn it higher, I need to cook faster," but this wasn't courtesy, this was a small violent shove. It wasn't about the temperature, it was the assumption. The implicit message that my need meant nothing, that my pizza was collateral in his life. Mere hath any ek thin line of heat run key like anger pulsing under my skin. I heard his bedroom click closed. I went back to my room and sat on the narrow mattress and watched the little glowing digits of the oven timer, as if that small light would save me from thinking about how small my life felt. When the buzzer went off, I padded out barefoot and opened the oven, and the smell hit like betrayal, smoke and burnt cheese and something crisp to black. My pizza, the one concession allowed in my month of budgeting, was ruined just enough to be trash. The man who had put his chicken in the oven, let's call him Jay, he was the type you couldn't miss. Short hair, cheap cologne, a laugh that sounded practiced like he learned it from his phone. He walked down the hall like he owned the air he breathed, like the world owed him space. I saw him hunched over the tray scraping chicken furiously like he had been taught to fix mistakes with a spatula and a shrug. For a second the world narrowed to the metal of that rack and the taste of charcoal in my mouth. My heart hammered slow like a fist turning in my ribs, my jaw clenched until I heard the tiny click of my teeth. Anger is not lightning, it's slow and mechanical at first, then it learns to roar. I could have said something polite like, "Hey, next time check with me." I could have knocked until my knuckles ached or stooped to the level of name-calling and pettiness. But that night I was exhausted in a different way. I was exhausted from the small humiliations the life had given me, the way the universe seems to have a tally for every small thing, and I was tired of being told by other people's carelessness that I mattered less. I stormed into the kitchen with the kind of movement that carries decision like a blade. I didn't speak, I didn't knock, I didn't ask permission. I reached for the oven dial and cranked it up to 500, and I did it slow like a man who knows he is crossing a line and wants the weight of the crossing to be felt. I left the chicken there and walked back along the dim hallway under the same posters that had always told us to be considerate. Inside my room the silence landed like a verdict. I sat on the mattress and tried to breathe, but the smoke alarm began to shout like a judge losing patience. I heard his cursing and the heavy sound of footwear, and then footsteps pounded down the hall like someone trying to hide a mistake with noise. I opened my door partway and stood in the dark and said in a voice quieter than I felt, "Everything all good, bud?" Half ominous, half bored and precise. He looked up red-faced, struggling to scrape the skin of char off with the edge of a fork, and he stammered something that was not an apology, more like a scramble. I went back in and ate the rest of my burned slice because it was mine, and because in that small choice I felt the taste of something that was not just food but dignity returned in a bitter way. Days later I moved out. I packed my things in a cheap duffel and took them away like a man leaving a war zone behind. But the truth is that moment was only the first crack in 100 small fissures that built out the slow burn of the story I want to tell you now. Because petty revenge is a seed and slow burn revenge is a garden you carefully tend until the harvest comes. You need to understand the small things to know why that oven dial mattered. You need to know what it feels like to be hungry in a world full of people who have never known that particular small shame. You need to know what it feels like to be the one who always compromises, to always be the person who's quiet on purpose so as not to be the problem. And you need to know what Jay was like when the lights were on and people were not watching, which was the crucial part. Jay wasn't a bad person in the big dramatic way, he was lazy cruel in the tiny social ways that add up to something ugly. He took other people's food and used their shampoo and left his plates crusted and dried because somebody would clean them eventually. He played music loud as if he could drown out the guilt with bass. He joked about the others like he collected small humiliations like trophies. He was the kind of guy who would borrow your charger and leave it on the radiator broken because replacing it required an effort he avoided at all costs. To him, the apartment was a convenience store where other people's patience paid his everyday living. I started noticing small incidents. His dishes left overnight, his voices in the hallway laughing with guests while my rent checks sat due on Tuesday. He would stand in small clusters and inspect your life like a curator at a flea market and pass a silent verdict. He would say in that half-loud, half-smug voice, "Man, you should really get better stuff," about the pizza boxes he saw on my bed like he owned taste. But he never asked for anything, he always took. So the oven incident sat in me like a grain of sand. It irritated me at first, then took residence, then it built like a slow infection until I began to see all the tiny places he had eroded my comfort and the dignity of others. I started watching him in the hallway like you watch the weather in a season of storms. I measured his habits, learned his habits. When he went to the store, when he left in the morning, the rhythm of his returns. And slowly revenge started to take a form not of rage but of craft. Let me tell you the art of slow burn. It's patience with a plan. If you are impulsive, you will get justice for a minute, and then you will be left with the nausea of regret. Slow burn revenge is like writing an accusation in a ledger where each small line is a reason, and when you hand that ledger to fate, the ledger reads like proof. I started keeping a small notebook. I wrote down every slight, his small selfishnesses, every time he used our spaces and seemed to believe there were no consequences. The list grew long fast. I photographed plates left in the sink, the crumb trails from his midnight feasts, the times he left the front door unlocked, the nights his guests came in loud and left trash in the stairwell. I wasn't trying to shame him publicly at first, I was building clarity for myself. The ledger was something to hold when my own mind whispered that I was overreacting. And as I watched, I noticed how his arrogance was not just casual, he performed it. He played a role with his posture, and the way he used his laughter to place himself at the center. So my plan needed to unmask performance with reality in a way that couldn't be dismissed as petty or coincidence. I needed a result that would feel inevitable once seen and undeniable to everyone else who shared that building. I could have gone for humiliation alone, but humiliation without cost changes nothing. If you humiliate someone and it costs you your peace, then you lose. So I wanted balance. A blow that took from him exactly what he had taken from others, an equivalence of loss that tasted fair in a world that rarely keeps balance. The first stage was small and surgical. I started with the charger he always borrowed. I found 3 identical cables cheap online and labeled them, if you can believe it, with tiny laminated tags reading property of basement A3. I left one in the microwave, one in the bathroom, one in his laundry basket. When he noticed, he shrugged and kept them all. Then I started returning little favors and small inconveniences to their rightful places. His shampoo ended under the sink next to the communal mop. His coffee mug replaced with a chipped one found in the bin. Each micro-action was a message that the boundaries existed and would be enforced. Then I escalated to reputation management. I quietly mentioned in passing to the landlord that the building needs to keep an eye on the kitchen use because food left in ovens is getting burned and someone malfunctions the alarm late at night. The landlord grunted and made vague promises, but the man from upstairs actually came down for a check and left a finger wag. I wanted a public eye because Jay's performance relied on the anonymity of a shared space. My favorite move was less visible but more delicious. I began to document ledger entries in a folder on my phone, and I started writing actual letters, polite but factual notes to be left anonymously around the communal board. Please do not change oven settings without permission, one said in clean typed letters with a small footer that read building courtesy notice. People chuckled reading it, but when the same note appeared the next week and the next week with differences and timestamps, someone started to look guilty. Jay bit his cheeks in a way I'd never seen before when he read the notices. He tried to laugh it off, but the laugh came out thin. Weeks rolled like a slow drumbeat, and he grew twitchy. The man who thought himself unobserved began double-checking his trails. He started to look over his shoulder to see if someone had put his plate away or slid his laundry out of the wash before he got back. He told a friend once at the old vending machine, "Someone is messing with me," and his friend shrugged like good riddance. And then the real pivot happened, like a trap springing. I needed him to make one big mistake so obvious it would become the thing everyone remembered, not just a rumor. I engineered the conditions. Everyone has pet vulnerabilities, and Jay's was his pride in being the center of attention, the idea that he could hold parties and people would revolve around him. So I found small ways to make those parties feel less like his stage and more like a mirror. One night he invited 4 people over. He paraded them across our hallway like a man giving a tour of his ego. I made sure the kitchen lights were dimmed, cooled the oven an hour before his guests arrived. I preheated it only to a mild warmth, and took out a tray with the faintest film of grease and placed it on the counter in full view. I placed within plain sight a typed note on the fridge that read in soft font, "Please do not oversmoke food, thank you." Then I set a small bowl on the counter with a lid. Inside it a cheap smoke bomb meant for theatrical releases, cheap but potent, the kind used in a stage production. I set the bulb to timer and walked back to my room with the deliberate steps of a man who will watch the sky fall but first wants to know how it looks. The evening started in that way parties begin, in half light and slow music and too much confidence. They laughed in the living room, the clatter of syllables and cigarette smoke, and the sound of someone thinking this night will be remembered for being loud and brilliant. Then the oven light flashed, and the smell began like the first note of a chord going wrong, a sweetness turning acrid. Someone reached for the oven, and in the space of a few seconds the cheap theatrical smoke bomb did its work, filling the kitchen with choking haze. The alarm gave one short long buzz, then ramped into full screaming. People coughed and spluttered, and from the hall a neighbor banged on the wall in irritation. Jay's guests fled into laughter that bordered on panic. A couple of them sprinted for the stairwell, like rats leaving a ship. Jay stood red-faced, hands flailing, incredulous, his party throttled by something he couldn't blame on the world except his own arrogance. I stepped into a hallway with my face calm and said in Urdu, soft and exact, "Kuch galat ho gaya?" like a man who had come to check if the weather was okay. He sputtered a profanity, his face collapsed into a mask of fury, and then shame, all mixed in a way that peeled him clean before everyone else's eyes. This was not about burning his burgers or spoiling his moment, this was exposing his vulnerability in a way that could not be laughed away. People laughed at first, like the usual mocking of someone who had been put in a corner and couldn't dance their way out. But then the landlord came out, and the party was fined for noise and misuse of common space, and Jay had to pick up the cost of the cleaning and the replacement of the smoke detector cover. The ledger swelled a little more, the reputation chip fell. Slow burn revenge is not about instant satisfaction, it's about making sure the person feels the erosion over time. The small losses, the social dips, the little cuts that when added make a wound. I wanted him to feel inconvenience and shame that matched the small cruelties he dished out to others over months and years. He retaliated, he tried to pin blame on a roommate, he barked at the board members, he tried to call me out once a week with righteous anger, but he had been caught in the act of his own entitlement, and people had begun to watch him differently. When someone turns the mirror, his performance loses its power because he was a performer, not a person in the old sense, and he had always depended on the blackout of attention to keep himself afloat. Months passed like curtains slowly lifting, and the apartment did something strange. It healed in the small ways it had been wounded by his presence. The trash started being taken out on time more often, cups stopped disappearing, the oven rules were respected because the group reinstated them with a tone of quiet severity, and the landlord put up the typed notices in a formal bracket. Our lives were smaller and better in ways I could barely name, but which every night before sleep I counted like a private accounting of success. But the final harvest had to be poetic, not petty. I did not want to scream in his face, nor did I want to be the person who celebrates at someone's ruin. My ledger wanted fairness, not blood. So I crafted something that would feel like fate to everyone else, and be the closing note to his slow decline. It happened on a late autumn night when he had finally convinced the building that he was considering moving out, and he threw a small farewell party to keep up appearances. He invited a few people and 3 of his friends who were the kind that liked to film everything they did. I planned for months for that night without them knowing. I knew Jay's pride, and I knew how much he loved the image of being the guy who had the house on the last night downtown. I targeted the thing he loved most, his persona, not his possessions. At 11:30 I slipped into the kitchen with a glass of water and a neutral face. I placed on the table a small wrapped box labeled with a neat printed tag that read, "Thanks for the memories." Inside the box I put a simple envelope with a note and a printed collage of pictures collated from the months. The nights he left, trashed the plates he abandoned, the faces of neighbors who had once smiled but now looked wary. I had left the photos anonymous, no caption, just truth. And I left it on his counter like an unexpected present from a stranger. In the background the music swelled, the laughter climbed, and the cameras flashed. Someone found the box with the sort of horror you see on a man who realizes the world he made of mirrors has more windows than he thought. Jay's hand hovered, then grabbed, and his face went white like someone who suddenly remembers every intersection they have ignored. He opened the envelope, and the room fogged with the sound of small ones like whispers being listened to. And then someone in the group laughed, the wrong laugh, a snort that sounded cruel, and one of his friends asked him, "What is this, bro?" And the laughter pushed the sound forward like a public opinion forming. He tried to dismiss it, tried to wave it off, his voice got thin. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice did not carry. People read the photos and the notes, and the way the pictures matched moments made the room quiet, not the polite quiet, but the honest kind. They saw the truth of someone who had been careless with other people's dignity and possessions, and the mirror came in clear glass. He stood there unmoored for the first time in his life, not because he had no things but because his little social currency had evaporated. He blinked and his breath hitched, and then he left the party without his friends, the kind of exit that carries more shame than any insult could. The landlord, who had been watching for months, called him in the next morning and asked for rent past due and charges that had built up from broken rules and missing fees. He had to admit to things he had shrugged off before, and with that his network thinned. The friends who filmed him distant and the small allies who stood by him began to look away. He left eventually, not with a triumphant suitcase but with a small bag and an absence that had the weight of consequence. I remember watching the door close behind him, not with jubilation but with the slow quiet of someone who had done what they needed to do. Karmic justice is not the loud party, it is the careful accounting, the ledger closing, and the small restoration of dignity that had been eaten away for months. The apartment breathed easier. People cooked without fear of their plates being stolen or their ovens sabotaged. Small kindnesses returned because when a person is removed who takes more than he gives, the space rebalances. I moved out some months later to a place with better light and a balcony where I could grow a tiny basil plant that survived on neglect and sunlight. I thought about Jay sometimes, not with hate, but with a dull pity for a man who never learned how to treat other people as whole things, not items to be curated for his amusement. I kept the tiny notebook for a while, then I burned it in a safe place, and I spread the ash on the windowsill because rituals matter for closure. In the end, the revenge was not a trophy, it was a reclamation. It was the repair of quiet lives, the little corrections that made our nights better and our shared spaces respectful. It was a reminder that cruelty repeated in small doses becomes a habit until someone decides to ration it out back in exact measure. If you've ever been the person whose pizza got burned or whose phone charger disappeared, know this: you are not alone and small justice is possible. You do not always need fireworks to be heard, sometimes you just need a ledger and patience, and the courage to pull the veil away when the performance is ready to be unmasked. Reflective pause, voice softer now, like a slow exhale. Karma rarely arrives as a thunderbolt. Most times it is a calendar of small things added up and returned. And the sweetest justice is not the loud ruin, but the quiet awakening of a room that remembers how to look after itself. If this story hit a nerve, hit the like button and share your own petty revenge in the comments. If you want more slow burn confessions and cinematic justice stories, subscribe and I'll bring you another one next week. And if you ever find your pizza burnt, remember this: sometimes patience is the sharpest blade.